Morning depth. The lights in Section 14 went out at 3:47, and Elder Suveth knew then that they were going to die. Not immediately, not in the next hour or even the next several hours, but the cascade had reached Section 14 now, which meant it had moved faster than Engineer Chief Dalpetrus had projected, which meant the projection models were wrong, which meant everything downstream of those models was wrong too. Life support, heat retention, atmospheric recycling, all of it running on timelines that were no longer accurate. Suveth stood on the bridge of the TCV morning depth and watched the section status board update in real time and did the mathematics that nobody else on the bridge wanted to do out loud. 4,217 souls aboard, families, children, elderly passengers making the slow transit to the outer colonies to be near their children's children. A civilian transport vessel, enormous, comfortable, built for safety and capacity, and the quiet dignity of long-distance travel, built for absolutely nothing that was currently happening to it. The drive failure had begun 14 hours ago. Not dramatically, not an explosion or a collision or anything that announced itself as the beginning of a catastrophe. A fault in the primary coupling array, the kind of fault that maintenance logs flagged and engineers addressed in the normal course of operations. Except that when Engineer Chief Dalpetrus had gone to address it, the fault had cascaded in a direction that the morning depths engineering systems had no protocol for, because the specific combination of factors that produced it had never been modeled, because it was the kind of failure that should not have been possible in a vessel of this class. Should not have been possible, and yet. 14 hours later, Section 14 was dark. The drive was completely offline. Backup power was running at 31% and falling, and the morning depth was drifting in the deep silence of Corridor Null 7, empty space, nobody's jurisdiction, the long empty stretch between the Tharan transit lanes and the nearest inhabited system. Chosen for this route because it was quiet and uneventful, and the kind of space that civilian vessels crossed without incident approximately 10,000 times per year. It had been quiet and uneventful right up until it wasn't. Navigator Pelerin was at her station on the bridge, her left arm in a temporary brace from the console impact she had taken when the drive failure sent a shockwave through the ship systems. She was 26 years old, the youngest senior crew member on the morning depth, and she had been awake for 19 hours and was running on something beyond adrenaline that she did not have a name for. Her bioluminescent patterns, the light that ran along Tharan's skin and shifted with emotion the way human faces shifted with expression, were cycling slowly between the deep blue of focused concentration and the pale gray-white of fear. She was trying to hold them steady. She was not entirely succeeding. The Tharan were a species that had evolved in the deep oceans of their homeworld, and they had carried certain things up with them when they reached space. The bioluminescence, the deep sensitivity to pressure and current, the specific social architecture of a civilization that had developed in 3 dimensions where every direction was equally viable. They were physically elegant, roughly humanoid, but with a fluidity of movement that spoke of a gravity relationship different from most land-evolved species. Their faces were broad, their eyes large and adapted to low light, their skin carrying the permanent soft glow of light-producing cells that had been communicating emotion and intention between them for 100,000 years. They were gentle. It was not a performance or a cultural preference. It was something bone-deep, bred into them by an evolutionary history that had found cooperation and communication more effective than competition and conflict. The Tharan had not fought a war in 4,000 years. They had no military. They had no weapons systems. The morning depth had no weapons systems. It had never needed any. Pelerin looked at the section status board and then at Elder Suveth and let her bioluminescent patterns say what her voice was not yet ready to say. The pale gray-white deepened. Suveth saw it and felt the same color moving through his own skin, and contained it with the deliberate effort of someone who had been leading people through difficult things for 60 years, and knew that his own visible fear would cost more than it expressed. Suveth was very old. He had been old when he took the position of elder aboard the Morning Depth, had been old for most of his adult life in the way that some Tharan were simply old early, deep-eyed, slow-moving, carrying something in the set of their shoulders that was not weariness but weight. He had overseen 312 transits in his career. He had never lost a passenger. He had never lost a crew member. He had accumulated, over 60 years, a reputation for the specific kind of reliability that becomes invisible because nothing ever goes wrong. Something had gone wrong. He looked at the section board for a long time. Then he looked at Engineer Chief Dal Petrus, who was at the engineering station with the hollow expression of someone who has run out of solutions and has not yet fully accepted that fact. "Dal," he said quietly. Dal Petrus looked up. "How long?" Suveth said. Not a question exactly, more an invitation to say out loud what they both already knew. Dal Petrus looked at his console. He had the specific stillness of an engineer confronting the limits of engineering, the moment when the numbers stop being a problem to solve and start being a reality to face. "At current cascade rate," he said, "life support in the passenger sections begins failing in approximately 19 hours. Heat retention goes critical in 14. He paused. "I have tried everything I can access from this station. The cascade is in the primary coupling architecture. Without external engineering support at the physical drive level, I cannot stop it. 19 hours, 14 for heat." Suveth stood very still for a moment. The bridge was quiet in the way that spaces go quiet when everyone in them is doing the same mental calculation, and nobody wants to be the first to say the answer. He looked at the communication station, at Navigator Pellerin, watching him from her console with her left arm in its brace, and her bioluminescence cycling that pale, frightened gray-white. "Open all frequencies," he said, "including the human bands." The bridge went a different kind of quiet. It was a small sound, barely audible, more felt than heard, the collective intake of breath from 7 crew members simultaneously. The bioluminescent patterns around the bridge shifted. Several went the specific amber gold of alarm. Pellerin's went still for a moment, all colors suspended, which was the Tharan equivalent of a very long pause. "Elder," said Communications Officer Vethsan carefully, "the human frequencies." "I know," Suveth said. "The stories." "I know the stories." He looked at Vethsan steadily. His own bioluminescence had settled into something that was not quite any single color, a complex mixture of gray-white fear and deep blue, resolve that the Tharan called Thareth Sol, the color of a decision made in full knowledge of its costs. "I also know that Section 14 is dark and we have 14 hours before the cold starts killing people. Open all frequencies." Vethsan opened all frequencies. The SOS went out at 4:12, broadcast on every band the Morning Depths communication array could reach. In every language the translation system carried, including 3 human languages and the standard emergency protocol format that was recognized across every spacefaring civilization in this region of the galaxy. Then the Morning Depth drifted in the dark of Corridor Null 7, and its 4,217 souls waited, and the stories about humans ran through the ship like a cold current, carried in whispered conversations in the passenger corridors and the darkening sections, and the medical bay where the impact injuries from the drive failure cascade were being treated. The stories were not reassuring. Pellerin, sitting at her navigation console with her arm in its brace, turned to Suveth after an hour of silence. "What do you think they will do?" she asked. Her voice was quiet. Her bioluminescence had gone very still, not the stillness of all colors suspended, but the stillness of someone who has chosen to be calm and is holding it with both hands. Suveth looked at her. He thought about the stories. He thought about what he knew, which was not very much, he admitted honestly to himself. Not the kind of knowing that came from direct experience, only the kind that came from accounts passed through intermediaries who had their own fears and their own angles. He thought about the choice he had made to open the human frequencies. "I don't know," he said. It was the most honest answer he had. Admiral Grace Okonkwo was reviewing supply chain reports for the Border Colony Network when the SOS hit her desk at 6:19 station time, forwarded automatically from the Deep Space Relay array that her office monitored as a matter of standard operational protocol. She read it once. She pressed the fleet activation control on her desk console. The time between reading the SOS and pressing the activation control was approximately 4 seconds. She had never timed it herself, but her adjutant, who had worked with her for 11 years, had timed it twice out of curiosity, and both times the gap was under 5 seconds. It was not that Okonkwo was impulsive or failed to think. It was that for her, the thinking and the acting were not sequential processes. Someone had sent an SOS. The thinking about what to do about that was not a separate step from doing it. It had been resolved before she finished reading the first line. She was 61 years old, silver-haired, built like someone who had spent 40 years doing physical work and not stopped. She had a face that journalists tended to describe as severe until they spoke with her for more than 10 minutes, after which they tended to revise that description to something else entirely. She had run, over the course of her career, more rescue operations than combat engagements, and she had views about that ratio that she expressed when asked and did not volunteer when not. The fleet was moving in 4 minutes. 11 ships. Someone on her staff processing the activation order would later note carefully in the operational log that 11 ships was significantly more than the minimum required for a rescue operation of this type and scale, and would wonder whether it was proportionate. Okonkwo, when she reviewed the log, added a single line to that note. Unclaimed space, unknown hazards, 4,200 souls. 11 ships is appropriate. She did not elaborate further. She did not feel it required elaboration. Aboard the UHCS Indomitable, Captain Hideo Tanaka received the fleet activation order and began moving simultaneously. He was 44, compact and precise in the way of someone who had spent 20 years in spaces where imprecision had consequences, with a quality of absolute focus that his crew had come to recognize as his baseline rather than his elevated state. He was focused all the time. During the engagement, he was focused in a slightly different direction. He reviewed the Tharan file during transit. It was not a long file. Human direct contact with the Tharan was limited, most intelligence on their civilization coming from second-hand sources, but it was detailed enough for his purposes. Non-militarized, civilian vessel, 4,200 aboard including significant numbers of non-crew passengers, drive failure cascade, life support degrading. He forwarded the medical section of the file to Dr. Yusuf Ademi with a note that said, "Review transit time. Prepare for species you have not treated before." Ademi's response came back in 6 minutes, already reading. His response was characteristically brief. Ademi was not a brief man in person. He was warm, expansive, the kind of doctor who talked to patients in complete paragraphs and remembered the names of their children. But his written communications were precise and short, a professional habit that the people who worked with him found reliable. In the medical bay, Ademi was doing 3 things simultaneously: reading the Tharan biological file, dictating equipment reconfiguration orders to his staff, and eating a meal that he had started before the activation order and saw no reason to abandon since the transit would take 6 hours, and skipping a meal would not help anyone. He was 52, large and unhurried seeming in the specific way of a man who has learned to move efficiently through crisis, with the kind of hands broad, extremely steady, that people noticed when he used them. He had treated 37 alien species in his career. The Tharan would be 38. Each new one was a puzzle, and he found puzzles genuinely interesting, which was either the best quality a ship's doctor could have or the most alarming one depending on your perspective. He read the Tharan file and thought about pressure sensitivity, bioluminescence as a physiological system, atmospheric requirements, the specific ways that an ocean-evolved physiology handled thermal stress differently from a land-evolved one. He made notes. He revised equipment lists. He consulted with his staff, who were already working from their own reads of the forwarded file with the focused efficiency of a medical team that had done this kind of preparation before and knew what it required. Lieutenant Commander Rosa Delgado, tactical officer, ran a different set of calculations during the same transit window. She was 38, dark-haired, with the specific economy of movement of someone trained in close-quarters security operations, who had never entirely stopped moving that way even in contexts that didn't require it. She ran the security protocols for the rescue zone with the same thoroughness she applied to everything: threat assessment, perimeter parameters, response options for a range of scenarios that included things going wrong in ways that couldn't be entirely predicted. Corridor Null 7 was unclaimed space. No jurisdiction. The Tharan ship's distress signal had been broadcasting for hours before the human fleet received it, which meant it had been broadcasting to anyone in range, which meant there was no guarantee that the human fleet would be the only ones who responded, or that everyone who responded would be responding with rescue in mind. She flagged this assessment to Captain Tanaka. He acknowledged it and told her to prepare accordingly. She was already preparing accordingly. The acknowledgement was a formality, which was fine. Formalities served their purpose. Petty Officer Quame Assant was in the engineering section of the Indomitable when the activation order came through. In the middle of a routine maintenance cycle, on the secondary power coupling, that he set aside with the unhurried competence of a 25-year-old, who had learned early that you never finished a maintenance cycle if you waited for a moment without interruptions. He stored his tools, reviewed the activation briefing, and began the pre-deployment checks for the rescue engineering kit, the specialized equipment carried by human vessels for exactly this kind of operation, configurable for a range of ship architectures and drive systems. He was on his first major deep space deployment. He had been on the Indomitable for 4 months. He had spent those 4 months learning the ship and learning the crew and discovering, with gradual accumulation of evidence, that he had landed somewhere that matched his expectations in the ways that mattered and exceeded them in the ways he hadn't thought to expect. The Indomitable ran well. The crew knew their business. Captain Tanaka had a quality of leadership that Assant was still finding words for. Not inspiring. Exactly. Not the kind of leadership that generated speeches and memorable moments, but deeply reliable in a way that made you understand bone deep that the person in charge had thought about every relevant scenario and made their decisions ahead of time. He checked out the rescue kit methodically. He thought about what he knew about Tharan engineering, which was approximately nothing beyond what the briefing file contained, and reminded himself that machines had underlying principles regardless of who built them, and that those underlying principles were more universal than people sometimes credited. He would figure it out. The fleet moved at maximum transit speed, 11 ships pushing hard through 6 hours of deep space, every crew member doing their preparation work with the focused calm of a force that had a specific job to do and had spent their careers getting ready to do it. There was no debate about whether to go, no political assessment of the implications, no waiting for authorization from committees that would need briefings and discussion periods. Someone had sent an SOS. The fleet moved. The Indomitable came out of transit at 12:47, and the first thing Captain Tanaka registered was the morning depth. It was enormous. He had known from the file that Tharan civilian transports were large, but the file data translated differently into direct visual. The vessel was nearly 3 times the length of the Indomitable, built in the flowing curved architecture that the Tharan favored. Its hull designed to evoke the deep ocean forms of their homeworld. At full power it would have been beautiful. The hull carried bioluminescent panels that the Tharan used for communication and identification between vessels, and at full power those panels would have been cycling through their patterns like something alive. At 31% backup power and falling, most of the panels were dark. The ones still lit were cycling slow and irregular, the vessel equivalent of labored breathing. 3 sections of the hull showed the specific color change that indicated hull temperature loss, not catastrophic yet, not breached, but cold in ways that would become critical within the next few hours. The morning depth looked like something trying not to die. Tanaka looked at it for perhaps 3 seconds. Then he looked at his crew and said, "Hailing frequency. Standard emergency protocol, Tharan language first." Felix, this ship's communications officer, a young woman named Lieutenant Aisha Karam, had the hail up before he finished the sentence. "Hailing on all emergency frequencies. Tharan primary, standard secondary." The response took 40 seconds. On the bridge of the morning depth, the sudden arrival of 11 human warships had produced something close to panic. Suveth had been awake for 22 hours, and he felt every one of them in the specific physical way of age, the weight behind his eyes, the slight unreliability of his joints, the way his bioluminescence had gone to the dull amber gray of deep exhaustion. He watched the human fleet come out of transit and form up around the morning depth with the practiced precision of a military force, executing a familiar operation, and he felt the fear move through the bridge crew like a physical thing, visible in every bioluminescent pattern around him. Large ships moving fast, surrounding them. He had made the decision to call for help on all frequencies, including the human bands. He stood by that decision. He also acknowledged, in the honest privacy of his own mind, that standing by a decision did not make the consequences of it less frightening. The hail came through. Vethsan at communications turned to him with an expression he couldn't entirely read. "Human vessel hailing, Tharan language. They're asking," she paused, checking the translation, "how many injured and what do you need first?" The bridge was silent. Suveth stood very still. He replayed the translation in his head. "How many injured and what do you need first? Not who are you or identify your command structure or prepare to be boarded. How many injured and what do you need first?" He looked at Pelerin. She was already at her communication station, her good hand on the transmit control, her bioluminescence doing something he had not seen from her in 22 hours of crisis. It had gone still. All the gray-white fear paused, not resolved but suspended, the color of someone who has registered something unexpected and is deciding how to respond to it. "May I answer, Elder?" she said. He nodded. Pelerin pressed transmit. "Human vessel," she said, in the careful standard that she had learned in navigation school and not used much since. "This is Navigator Pelerin of the TCV Morning Depth. We have 47 injured, most minor, 6 critical. We need engineering support for drive cascade failure and medical support for thermal exposure. Our heat retention is failing in the lower passenger sections." She paused. Then she added something that she had not planned to say, that came out with the specific unguarded quality of exhaustion and relief, and something she did not have a word for yet. "We did not know if anyone would come." There was a pause on the human side, shorter than she expected. Then a voice came back, male, accented in the way that human voices were always accented, carrying the specific timbre of someone speaking calmly in a situation that was not calm. "Navigator Pelerin, this is Captain Hideo Tanaka of the UHCS Indomitable. We are deploying medical and engineering teams now. We will need docking access at your port's secondary bay if it is functional. Tell me about the 6 critical cases." Pelerin told him. Tanaka listened without interrupting. When she finished, he said, "Our chief medical officer will be at your port's secondary bay in 12 minutes. His name is Dr. Yusuf Adami. He will need your medical team to brief him on your patients directly." A brief pause. "You were right to call. "We are glad you did. Tanaka out." Pelerin sat at her console for a moment after the channel closed. Her bioluminescence had done something that made Suveth watch her carefully. It had shifted to a color he had not seen on her before, or had not seen since she was very young, the warm amber gold that the Tharin called Hethsalon, the color of unexpected relief, the color of a door opening in a wall you had decided was solid. She looked at him. "They're coming," she said. "Yes," he said. They both looked at the section status board. Section 14 dark. Section 15 beginning to show temperature loss. 47 injured, 6 critical. "They asked what we needed first," Pelerin said. She seemed to be still processing this. "That was the first thing they asked." "Yes," Suveth said again. He did not say anything else. He was processing it too. Adami arrived at the Morning Depths Port Secondary Bay at 11 minutes and 40 seconds, slightly ahead of the 12-minute estimate, because the shuttle pilot had pushed the transit harder than standard when Adami had very calmly explained the thermal situation in the lower passenger sections. He came with 4 medical staff, 3 equipment cases, and the specific quality of focused attention that he brought to every new patient. The genuine interest of someone who found complexity engaging rather than daunting. He stepped into the Morning Depths docking corridor and registered, with the automatic observational habit of 3 decades in medicine, approximately a dozen things about the environmental conditions, the visible bioluminescent distress patterns of the 2 Tharin crew members who met him, and the structural assessment data showing on the section status board visible through the corridor's interior window. The Tharin crew members who met him were trying not to show fear and not entirely succeeding. Their bioluminescence was cycling amber gold alarm patterns that Adami recognized from the briefing file. He was aware that his arrival, large, human, uniformed, moving with purpose through their ship, was frightening them. He was aware that there was a tension between moving fast enough to save 6 critical patients and moving in a way that did not make the crew of a frightened civilian vessel more frightened. He had navigated this tension 37 times before, in 37 different alien medical situations, with 37 different species, and he had learned that the resolution was almost always the same: be exactly what you are. Don't perform calmness or gentleness. Simply be the person who is here to help and let the work speak for that. "My name is Dr. Yusuf Adami," he said, in the careful standard that his translation system carried to the Tharin communicators. "I need to reach your 6 critical patients immediately. Will you take me to them?" The taller of the 2 Tharin crew members, a young male whose bioluminescence was cycling so fast between colors it was almost strobing, looked at him for a moment with the large, low-light-adapted eyes that gave every Tharin he had ever seen the specific quality of someone who was looking at you very carefully. Then the bioluminescence slowed slightly. The young crew member turned and began walking, and Adami followed. The Morning Depths interior was beautiful in the specific way of a Tharin-built space: flowing curves, no hard angles, the aesthetic of deep water translated into architecture, even in a vessel running on 31% backup power with sections going dark around them. Adami noted it and filed it and kept walking. The medical bay was 3 levels down, and it was full. Adami walked in and the room changed. Not dramatically, not the way rooms change in stories, with everyone going still and staring. It was subtler than that. The Tharin medical staff currently working the room registered his arrival with a collective shift in their bioluminescent patterns, the amber gold alarm giving way to something more complex, more uncertain. The patients who were conscious and cognitively present registered it too. He walked to the nearest critical patient, a female, elderly, showing the specific skin discoloration that the briefing file associated with Tharin thermal exposure, and crouched to the patient's level and looked at her with the complete, undivided attention that was the first thing he gave every patient he had ever treated. "Hello," he said to her in Tharin, which his translator delivered imperfectly but with evident effort. I am a doctor. I am going to help you." Her bioluminescence, faint low power, the light of someone who was very cold and very tired, shifted slightly. Not to a specific color he could name, just shifted, away from the pale gray-white of fear. He opened his first equipment case and went to work. In the engineering sections of the Morning Depth, Petty Officer Quame Asant found something he had not entirely expected, which was that the Tharan engineers were very good at their jobs and were being absolutely prevented from doing them by the specific nature of the cascade failure, which had locked out access to the primary coupling architecture from every internal engineering station. He discovered this within the first 4 minutes of his arrival, partly from the briefing data and partly from direct observation of the engineering section, where 3 Tharan engineers were standing around a primary access panel with the specific body language, visible across species differences. He had found, of people who have tried every option available to them and have arrived at the options that are not available. He stood in the engineering section doorway with his kit and looked at the panel and looked at the 3 engineers and thought about what Dal Petrus had said in the distress log. The cascade is in the primary coupling architecture. Without external engineering support at the physical drive level, I cannot stop it. External engineering support at the physical drive level. That was what he was here for. He walked to the access panel and crouched in front of it and opened it and looked at what was inside. The Tharan drive architecture was different from human engineering in its aesthetics, the same flowing curves, the same avoidance of hard angles, components shaped like things that grew rather than things that were manufactured. But the underlying logic was the underlying logic. Power generation, power distribution, coupling systems, cascade fail-safes. The principles were universal. The implementation was unfamiliar. He had about 3 hours before the thermal situation became unrecoverable. He looked up at the 3 Tharan engineers standing around him with their alarm-pattern bioluminescence and their large eyes and their visible uncertainty about what he was doing and whether they should be helping or staying out of his way. He pointed at the taller one, the one whose bioluminescence had the specific focused quality that he associated with someone trying to think through a problem rather than react to one. Engineer, or at least engineering adjacent. Probably the most useful person in the room for what he needed to do. He pointed at the component at the far left of the coupling array. Then he looked at the engineer and raised his eyebrows, the human gesture for a question, which might or might not translate. The Tharan engineer looked at the component, then looked at him. Then their bioluminescence shifted briefly to a color that Asant did not have the reference to identify, and they crouched down beside him and pointed at the component, and then at a second component 2 positions to the right and made a gesture with their hands that meant. He was fairly certain, reading it through the universal language of people who understand machines. These 2 together, this is the problem. He nodded. They got to work. Outside the Morning Depth, Lieutenant Commander Rosa Delgado was having a different kind of morning. The Kessin vessels had been there when the human fleet arrived, 3 small ships, predatory in their design, the specific silhouette of vessels built for quick intercepts and rapid departure, sitting in what they probably considered a safe observation distance from the Morning Depth. Delgado had noted them in her first sensor sweep and assigned them a threat assessment of moderate hand watching, which meant they weren't an immediate problem, but were the kind of problem that became immediate if you stopped paying attention. The Kessin were, in the broad strokes, scavengers. Not pirates exactly. There was a distinction in Delgado's professional taxonomy between species that attacked functioning vessels and species that moved into distress situations after the fact and helped themselves to whatever was left. The Kessin were the second kind. It was not admirable, but it was also not an immediate threat to the rescue operation, as long as the rescue operation was clearly proceeding, and the Kessin understood they were visible. She hailed them on a secondary frequency, one that the Indomitable's communication system identified as compatible with Kessin vessel architecture. The response was 30 seconds of silence, followed by a very brief acknowledgement in Standard. Corridor Null 7 is unclaimed space, the Kessin vessel responded. We have operational rights here. You do, Delgado said pleasantly. So do we. We are conducting a rescue operation. We will be here for approximately 18 hours. She paused. I noticed you were already in position when we arrived. You must have picked up the distress signal early. That was probably very exciting for you. Another pause during which she said nothing, which was a more effective tool than most people gave it credit for. We will be here for approximately 18 hours, she said again, in exactly the same tone. The Kessin vessels did not respond. They also did not leave immediately. They waited for approximately 20 minutes, which Delgado observed with the specific patience of someone who had learned that patience was more effective than escalation in approximately 70% of these situations. At the 22-minute mark, all three Kessin vessels moved to a greater distance. At the 40-minute mark, they jumped to FTL. Delgado logged the interaction, flagged it for the regional patrol report, and went back to monitoring the rescue perimeter. The Vrail vessel arrived 2 hours and 17 minutes into the rescue operation. It came out of transit fast, faster than standard arrival protocol suggested, the speed of a vessel that had been pushing hard and had not particularly cared about the impression that made. It was a single ship, military class, the distinctive silhouette of a Vrail patrol vessel, angular where the Tharan were curved, built along lines that communicated function with no concession to aesthetics, flying the patrol markings of the Vrail compact. Delgado flagged it to Tanaka immediately. Tanaka was on the bridge of the Indomitable reviewing status reports from the rescue teams when Delgado's flag came through. He looked at the Vrail vessel on his sensor display for a moment. Then he opened the hailing frequency. Vrail patrol vessel, this is Captain Hideo Tanaka of the UHCS Indomitable, commanding a human rescue fleet currently conducting emergency operations in support of the TCV Morning Depth. You are welcome to this space. Please identify yourself and state your intentions. The response came back in under a minute, in standard, clipped and precise. This is Captain Warden Drosketh of the VCS Steadfast Honor. I am here in response to a distress signal from the TCV Morning Depth. I require an explanation of the human military presence surrounding a civilian Tharan vessel in unclaimed space. The specific word he used for explanation had a secondary meaning in standard Vrail, which Tanaka's translation system flagged automatically. It meant something between explanation and accounting, the kind of explanation you gave to someone who had the authority to evaluate whether it was satisfactory. Tanaka looked at the translation note. Then he said, calmly, Captain Warden, the Morning Depth experienced a catastrophic drive failure cascade 18 hours ago. They sent a distress signal on all frequencies. We responded. We currently have medical teams treating 47 injured crew and passengers, including 6 critical cases, and engineering teams working on the drive cascade. We expect to have the vessel stabilized within 8 hours and will escort it to the nearest repair facility. He paused. I would invite you to verify what I have just told you with your own sensors. You are also welcome to come aboard the Morning Depth and observe directly. I have no restrictions on either. The channel was silent for a moment. On the bridge of the Steadfast Honor, Captain Warden Drosketh stood very still and looked at his sensor display. He was 53 years old, a Vrail of the 3rd generation compact, meaning his family had served the peacekeeping structure of the Vrail compact for 3 generations before him, and he had spent his career developing a very specific instinct for situations that were not what they appeared to be. The Vrail had a saying, the surface of the water shows you the sky, not the bottom. You must always look for the bottom. He was looking for the bottom. His sensors showed 11 human warships in a formation around the Tharan vessel. Military grade. The Indomitable in close docking configuration with the Morning Depth's port secondary bay. shuttle traffic between human vessels and the Tharan ship, multiple trips, equipment and personnel, consistent with exactly what the human captain had described. He ran the sensor data through his tactical analysis system, which was built to identify military operations disguised as other things. The system returned an assessment after 40 seconds. The assessment said, consistent with rescue operation. Drosketh read it. He ran it again. The system returned the same assessment. He looked at the Tharan vessel, at the dark sections, at the hull temperature readings that showed a ship that had been going cold for hours, at the shuttle traffic. He thought about the briefings he had received on human military behavior. The files were extensive. The Vrail Compact maintained detailed assessments of every major spacefaring civilization, updated quarterly. The human file was one of the thicker ones, revised more frequently than most, because humans had a quality of behaving in ways that the previous revision had not fully accounted for. The current file described them as unpredictable, highly capable, with a documented tendency toward escalatory response in contested space. His sensor display was not showing escalatory response. His sensor display was showing shuttle traffic and medical equipment, and the specific energy signatures of engineering work on a failing drive system. He made a decision. "Captain Tanaka," he said, "I will take you up on the invitation to observe directly. I will come aboard the Morning Depth. One vessel, standard complement." There was a brief pause. Then Tanaka's voice came back, with exactly the same quality of calm it had carried throughout. "You are welcome, Captain Warden. I will have someone meet you at the port's secondary bay." Drosketh arrived at the Morning Depth with 4 crew members and the specific bearing of a Vrail military officer, conducting an inspection of a situation he did not yet fully understand. Upright, careful, observant, revealing nothing in his expression that he had not decided to reveal. Petty Officer Asant met him at the docking bay entrance, because Asant happened to be passing through on his way to retrieve a component from the rescue kit depot, and because Captain Tanaka, who had been informed of the Vrail arrival, had sent a quick message to whoever was nearest to the bay entrance. This was how Asant found himself standing in front of a Vrail patrol captain and 3 armed crew members with a piece of Tharan drive coupling in one hand, and his hair standing up from 4 hours of engineering work in zero-gravity crawlspaces. He stood up straight. "Petty Officer Quaim Asant, UHCS Indomitable," he said. "I can take you to Dr. Adami or the engineering section, whichever you'd prefer to see first, Captain." Drosketh looked at him for a moment. The Vrail were slightly taller than humans on average, built along leaner lines, with a skin coloration that shifted through gray and blue-gray tones and eyes that were forward-facing and gold-colored and very direct. They did not have a bioluminescent communication system. They were, like humans, a land-evolved species, and they communicated through voice and expression, and the specific physical language of a species that had developed in 3 dimensions of air rather than water. What they did have was a quality of complete attention that Asant, who did not have much experience with Vrail, nonetheless found immediately legible. This was someone who was paying full attention. "Engineering section," Drosketh said. Asant nodded and started walking. Drosketh fell into step beside him, his 4 crew members following. The engineering section was 3 corridors and 1 level down, and during the walk Drosketh sensors, the compact personal scanner that Vrail officers carried, standard equipment, were running a continuous environmental read on everything they passed. Life support metrics, hull temperature gradients, structural integrity reports visible on the section boards mounted at regular intervals along the corridors. What he was seeing was a ship that had been dying and was now stabilizing. The temperature gradient in the lower sections was still critical, but had stopped worsening. The life support metrics in the passenger corridors were holding. The Cascade Progress Indicator, A Tharan engineering readout that his translation system had required 4 minutes to fully parse was showing a rate of change that was moving in the right direction. He stepped into the engineering section and found a Science workspace. It was not what he had expected. He acknowledged this to himself with the honesty of a precise thinker reviewing his own assumptions. Something that looked like human military operation, organized, hierarchical, defined by clear lines of authority and controlled access. What he found was 2 humans and 3 Tharan engineers lying on the deck around an open access panel, surrounded by tools from both species' engineering kits, communicating through a combination of translation devices and hand gestures, and what appeared to be a shared diagramming surface that both species were drawing on simultaneously with their respective tools. He stood in the doorway and watched. Asant went back to his position by the access panel and said something to the Tharan engineer beside him. Drosketh's translation system caught most of it, a technical observation about coupling tolerances, and the Tharan engineer responded, and Asant nodded and reached into the access panel with a tool that Drosketh did not recognize as either human or Tharan standard equipment, something improvised from components of both, and made an adjustment, and one of the Tharan engineers, the female, who had been watching the cascade progress indicator, made a sound that Drosketh's translation system rendered as a single word. The word was yes. He stood in the doorway for 4 minutes. Nobody asked him to leave or paid him particular attention. The work continued. The cascade progress indicator continued to move in the right direction. Then he walked to the medical bay. Adami was working on his 3rd patient, a Tharan child, perhaps 8 years old by the developmental markers in the file, who had thermal exposure injuries on her hands and forearms from contact with a surface that had gone critically cold before the heat retention failure had been caught. Adami was working with the focused, unhurried precision of someone for whom the work itself was the full extent of his attention. No performance, no awareness of being observed, simply the complete presence of a physician with a patient. The child was awake. She was watching Adami with the large eyes of a Tharan child, and her bioluminescence, children's bioluminescent patterns were more expressive and less controlled than adults, responding more directly to emotion, was doing something that Drosketh observed with care. It was not the amber gold of fear. It was something warmer. The briefing file on Tharan bioluminescence that his system had pulled up described that specific warm yellow gold as Hethsalon, a comfort response, associated with safety, with the presence of someone trusted. A Tharan child in a dying ship, surrounded by a species she had certainly heard frightening stories about. Showing the color of safety. Drosketh stood very still for a moment. Adami finished his work on the child's hands, wrapped them in the thin thermal treatment that his equipment provided, and said something to her in Tharan. Drosketh's translation system caught it, imperfect but clear enough. "You will be warm soon," and the child said something back, and Adami laughed, a brief genuine sound, and moved to his next patient. Drosketh found Elder Suveth sitting in a chair beside Pelarin's bed in the recovery section of the medical bay, precisely as the outline of the day had suggested he would. Suveth looked up when Drosketh entered. He did not startle, which told Drosketh something about the state of the elder's exhaustion. He was beyond the threshold where surprises registered as surprises. He simply looked at the Vrail captain with the deep-eyed steadiness of someone who had been awake for 26 hours and had moved, somewhere in those 26 hours, past fear into something quieter. "Captain Warden," Suveth said. His standard was careful, deliberate, the accent of a Tharan who had learned it late in life. "I did not expect the compact to respond." "The distress signal reached our patrol range," Drosketh said. He paused. "I arrived expecting a different situation than the one I found." Suveth looked at him. Different how? Drosketh considered how to answer this precisely. I expected to find a human military operation, he said. I did not expect to find what is here. Suveth was quiet for a moment. Pelerin, in the bed beside him, was awake and had been listening since Drosketh entered the room. Her arm had been properly treated by Adami's team in the first hours, and the brace had been replaced with something more functional. Her bioluminescence was that quiet, warm amber gold, the Hethsalon that had surprised Drosketh when he saw it on the child. "Was this what you expected from humans?" Drosketh asked Suveth. It was a genuine question, not a rhetorical one. He wanted to know. Suveth thought about this with the seriousness of someone to whom the question mattered. "No," he said. "I heard the stories. We all hear the stories. The Deathworlders, the species that fights everything." He paused. "When I gave the order to broadcast on human frequencies, my crew was afraid. I was afraid." He looked at the room around him, at Adami moving between patients, at the Tharan medical staff working alongside human staff, with the careful coordination of people who have found a shared language for the work. What I expected was, I did not know what I expected. Something different from this. Drosketh looked at the room too, at the child with the warm-wrapped hands, at the 6 critical patients who were, according to the medical status board, no longer critical, at the cascade progress indicator on the engineering feed visible through the door, still moving in the right direction. "What will you put in your report?" Suveth asked. Drosketh was quiet for a long moment. "The truth," he said, "as precisely as I can state it." He excused himself and went back through the ship to the docking bay, walking slowly, his personal scanner still running its continuous read. Structural integrity continuing to stabilize. Temperature gradient in lower sections improving. Life support holding across all passenger corridors. He boarded his shuttle and returned to the Steadfast Honor, and sat in his cabin for a long time before he opened a new report file. Pelerin found a Sant in the engineering section 3 hours later, when the drive cascade had been sufficiently stabilized that Dal Petrus was confident they could hold without human engineering support for the transit to the repair facility. A Sant was packing the rescue kit, the systematic reverse of the deployment process. Each component checked, logged, secured. The improvised hybrid tools documented with the specific care of an engineer who understood that improvisation was only as good as the documentation of how it was done. She stood in the engineering section doorway and watched him for a moment. "Petty Officer Asant," she said. He looked up, his bioluminescence. Then he remembered he did not have bioluminescence, that humans communicated through their faces, and he looked at his face, which was tired and slightly surprised and open in the way of someone who has been focused on work for 6 hours and is still in that focused state. "Navigator Pelerin, how is your arm?" "Better," she said. She walked into the engineering section and stood near the access panel, which was closed now, the coupling architecture stabilized, the cascade indicators steady. She was quiet for a moment. Then, "Can I ask you something?" "Sure." She thought about how to say it. She had been thinking about how to say it since the hail from the Indomitable, since Captain Tanaka's voice saying how many injured and what you need first, since Suveth standing beside her on the bridge and saying yes when she asked if she could answer. She had been carrying the question through 26 hours of crisis, and she was not sure she had the right words in standard, but she was going to try. "When your fleet received our signal," she said, "why did you come?" Asant looked at her. It was not a simple question. He could hear that it was not a simple question, that it was carrying something beneath the surface, something that had been built up over 26 hours of fear and relief, and watching humans move through a dying Tharan ship with their equipment cases and their steady hands. He thought about how to answer it honestly. "Someone needed help," he said finally. That's what you do. When someone sends an SOS, you go. It's not a policy or a calculation, it's just what you do." Pelerin looked at him for a long moment. Her bioluminescence was very still, that all colors suspended quality of someone processing something carefully. "We were afraid of what you would do when you came," she said. "The stories we have heard about humans." "I know the stories," he said. He said it without defensiveness, just acknowledgement. "The stories are not about this," she said. He looked at her steadily. "No, they're not." She was quiet for a while. Outside the engineering section, the morning depth was stabilizing around them. The sounds of a ship returning to something like function, the specific rhythm of systems coming back online, the difference between the sounds of a dying vessel and a recovering one that you could feel before you could fully hear it. "We almost didn't send the signal on human frequencies," she said. "We were more afraid of being helped by you than of dying in the dark." Asant absorbed this. He did not deflect it or minimize it. He held it with the seriousness it deserved. "I'm glad you sent it," he said. Pelerin looked at him for one more long moment. Then her bioluminescence shifted to the warm amber gold, the Hethsalon, and she said, "So are we," and turned and walked back through the ship toward the bridge. Asant watched her go. Then he went back to packing the rescue kit, methodically, each component checked and logged, the documentation thorough, because the next time someone needed this kit, the person using it would need to know exactly what had been in it, and exactly what had been improvised and why. He made the documentation very complete. The morning depth made the transit to the repair facility at Verath Station under escort of the full human fleet, moving at a speed calibrated to the stabilized but not fully functional drive system, a pace that took 11 hours rather than the standard 4. 11 hours of convoy travel through deep space, human warships flanking a Tharan civilian vessel, medical teams rotating between ships, engineering teams running final diagnostics on the Cascade repairs. During those 11 hours, something happened on the morning depth that no one had planned and no one had directed, and no one would have predicted from the outside. The fear went away. Not all of it, not immediately, not in a single dramatic moment. It happened the way most real things happen, gradually, accumulating in small exchanges and ordinary moments, the specific chemistry of shared experience and evident good faith working on a population of 4,217 people who had spent 26 hours in the particular intimacy of crisis. The children who had watched Adami with their bioluminescence showing Hethsalon. The engineering teams who had built a shared technical language out of hand gestures and borrowed tools. The medical staff who had worked alongside human staff through the night and learned what human medical attention looked like from the inside. The fear did not go away because humanity was not frightening. The fear went away because something more specific had been learned. Not that humans were not dangerous, but that dangerous and willing to help were not mutually exclusive, that the stories about what humans would do in a crisis had been missing a category, that the category existed. Elder Suveth stood on the bridge of a ship that was now warm throughout and had all its section boards green and watched Verath Station grow on the navigation display, and thought about what he was going to say when people asked him about this. They would ask. He knew they would ask. What were the humans like, and were the stories true, and what happened when the warships came? He was going to tell them the truth, as precisely as he could state it, which was what Drosketh had said, and what was, Suveth thought, the only honest response to something that had changed the shape of what you thought you knew. Admiral Grace Okonkwo was back at her desk at Forward Command, reviewing the post-operation reports, when Drosketh's message arrived through the Vrail Compact's diplomatic channel. It was 4 sentences. She read it once, then she read it again. The message said, "I arrived at the morning depth expecting to find a human military operation in unclaimed space. I found a rescue operation. I am filing a full report with the Compact. I wanted you to know that what I observed was something my briefing files did not prepare me for, and that I consider accurate witnessing more important than consistent file maintenance." She sat with it for a while. Outside her office window, The deep space of the forward region extended in every direction. The border corridors, the transit lanes, the long empty stretches between inhabited systems where things happened without witnesses, where a Tharan civilian vessel could drift in the dark for 22 hours before anyone answered. She thought about 11 ships moving at maximum transit speed toward an SOS, about a Damie in the medical bay with the child, about a Sant and the Tharan engineers on the floor of the drive section, about 4,217 people who had been afraid of what would come when the human fleet arrived, and who were now alive and warm and moving toward a repair facility. She thought about Drosketh's 4 sentences, about accurate witnessing more important than consistent file maintenance. She opened a reply. She wrote 3 words. "Thank you, Captain Warden." She sent it. Then she closed the message and turned back to the operational reports, and the forward region stretched outside her window in every direction, deep and dark, and full of things that had not happened yet. She had work to do.